In the spring of 1984, a field representative from the High Plains Underground Water Conservation District drove out to Earl Stroud's farm in the Texas Panhandle and asked to review his well records. The visit was part of a systematic compliance audit the district had been conducting across its service area for 2 years. The district had begun requiring annual production reports from permit holders in 1971, and by the early 1980s, it had identified a significant number of accounts where reporting had been inconsistent or absent. The audit was the district's effort to reconcile its permit records with actual well usage across the Panhandle counties it administered. Earl had been farming the same 480 acres in Castro County since he inherited the operation from his father in 1962. His grandfather, Earl Stroud, had drilled the well in 1937 and obtained the original permit from the district, one of the earliest permits on record in that part of the county, issued at a time when the Ogallala Aquifer was considered an essentially unlimited resource, and the district's primary concern was orderly development rather than conservation. The 1937 permit had carried a high allocation. August had been an early irrigator in an area where most of his neighbors were still farming dryland cotton, and the district's allocation formula in the late 1930s had rewarded early applicants with volume allowances that subsequent regulations had substantially reduced. The permit entitled the Stroud family to pump quantities from the Ogallala that would have been impossible to obtain under the rules that governed new permits by the 1970s and 1980s. Earl showed the district representative his files. The representative reviewed the annual production reports that the district required permit holders to file each January, a simple form documenting the previous year's pumping volume, the water level in the well, and the acreage irrigated. The district used these reports to track aquifer depletion, calculate remaining allocation, and verify that permit holders were pumping within their permitted limits. Earl's files showed reports filed in 1971, 1972, and 1973, then a gap, reports in 1976 and 1977, another gap, a report in 1980, then nothing for 1981, 1982, and 1983. The representative noted the gaps in his audit worksheet. He told Earl he would need to take the records back to the district office for review. Earl drove to the district's office in Lubbock 6 weeks later. The news was not good. Earl Stroud had drilled the Castro County well in the spring of 1937. Irrigation in the Texas Panhandle was still in its early development at that time. The large-scale center pivot systems that would eventually transform the region had not yet arrived, and most irrigation was done through surface flooding from open ditches fed by low-capacity pumps. August's well was a modest producer by later standards, but it was more than sufficient for the 160 acres he was farming in the early years of the operation. He obtained his permit from the High Plains Underground Water Conservation District shortly after drilling. The district had been established in 1932 to address concerns about unregulated groundwater development and had been issuing permits since the mid-1930s. August's permit was issued under the allocation rules of that era, which calculated permitted volume based on acreage and estimated crop water requirements without the aquifer depletion adjustments that would be incorporated into later regulatory frameworks. The result was a permitted annual pumping volume that reflected the water needs of the operation as August planned it, generous by any subsequent standard. The permit number was stamped on a metal placard that August had attached to the pump house wall in 1937. It was still there when Earl's father took over the operation in 1952, and when Earl himself inherited it in 1962. The placard had weathered and faded over the decades, but the permit number was still legible. Earl expanded the operation through the 1960s, taking the farmed acreage from 160 to 480 as he acquired additional parcels from retiring neighbors. He deepened the well in 1964 to reach the declining water table and installed a higher capacity turbine pump in 1967 that allowed him to irrigate the expanded acreage. The operation's water use grew substantially with the expansion, but the 1937 permit's allocated volume, set when August had been farming 160 acres with a modest pump, was more than sufficient to cover the larger operation's needs. Earl had never been close to pumping above his permitted allocation. In 1971, the district implemented a new annual reporting requirement for all permit holders. The requirement was administrative, a one-page form documenting the previous year's pumping volume, the current static water level in the well, and the acreage under irrigation. The district mailed the forms to permit holders each December and required return by January 31st of the following year. The requirement was intended to give the district a systematic picture of aquifer conditions across its service area. Earl filed the reports in 1971, 1972, and 1973. The forms were not complicated. He pulled the pump meter readings from his log, noted the water level measurement he took each fall, and mailed the form to Lubbock. 3 years of compliance. In 1974, the form arrived in December, as it always did. Earl set it on his desk with the intention of completing it after the holiday. He was dealing with a difficult harvest situation, equipment problems, a late crop, pressures that occupied his attention through the end of the year. January passed, February passed. He found the form in March, partially completed, and set it aside again. By spring he had forgotten it entirely. The pattern repeated in subsequent years with variations. Some years he filed. Some years he did not. He was aware the reports were required, but did not treat them with the same urgency as his USDA program filings or his operating loan documentation. The district sent reminder notices in years when reports were not received, but the notices arrived in the same mail stream as dozens of other agricultural administration communications and did not always receive immediate attention. By 1984, Earl had filed annual reports in 7 of the 13 years since the requirement had been implemented. He had not filed in 6 of those years. He had pumped water from the well in every one of those 13 years. The district's compliance determination arrived in a letter dated May 14, 1984. The letter informed Earl that his review of the account file had revealed a pattern of non-compliance with the annual reporting requirement that, under the district's rules as amended in 1978, constituted grounds for permit lapse. The 1978 amendment had established that a permit holder who failed to file annual reports for 3 or more years within any 10-year period would be deemed in non-compliance, and that upon a finding of non-compliance following a formal audit, the permit could be declared lapsed by the district's board of directors. The board had reviewed Earl's account at its April 1984 meeting and had voted to declare the original 1937 permit lapsed. Earl could apply for a new permit. The application would be processed under the district's current allocation rules, the framework that had been substantially revised in 1976 and again in 1980 to reflect aquifer depletion data and conservation requirements. Under the current rules, his 480-acre operation would be entitled to a permitted volume calculated on the basis of current per-acre allocation rates, not the 1937 rates that had governed his grandfather's original permit. The new allocation would be significantly lower than the original. Earl drove to Lubbock and met with the district's general manager, a man named Wallace Pruitt, who had been administering the district's permit program for 11 years. Pruitt explained the situation with the directness of someone who had delivered similar news before. The 1937 permit had been one of the most generous in the district's records. Its allocated volume reflected the regulatory environment of the late 1930s, before the district had implemented conservation-oriented allocation formulas. When Earl applied for a replacement permit under the current rules, his allocation would be calculated at the rates applicable to new permits in 1984, which were substantially lower per acre than the 1937 rates. Earl asked whether the 47 years of continuous use, his grandfather's pumping, his father's pumping, his own pumping, counted for anything in the replacement calculation. Pruitt told him that continuous use was not a factor in the replacement permit calculation. The district's rules allocated permitted volume based on current per-acre rates and current aquifer conditions. A new applicant in 1984 received the same calculation as a permit holder whose original permit had lapsed. The seniority embedded in the 1937 permit, the benefit of the early allocation rules that had generated a higher volume entitlement, could not be restored by a replacement permit issued under 1984 rules. To understand why Earl's 47 years of continuous well use had not preserved the original permit, it helps to understand the legal structure of groundwater rights in Texas and how that structure differs from the surface water framework that governs rivers and streams. Surface water in Texas follows the prior appropriation doctrine. First in time, first in right. In a system administered by the state, a senior surface water right established in 1937 retains its priority against junior rights established later, and that seniority cannot be lost through regulatory noncompliance alone. Groundwater in Texas operates under a different legal framework. Texas historically recognized the rule of capture for groundwater, a landowner's absolute right to pump water from beneath his property without liability to neighboring landowners affected by the pumping. The rule of capture meant that groundwater rights were initially tied to land ownership rather than to administrative permits. The High Plains Underground Water Conservation District had been established specifically to impose a permitting layer on top of the rule of capture. to manage the Ogallala Aquifer in a way that prevented unregulated depletion while preserving landowners' ability to use the resource. The district's permit system created administrative rights to pump specified volumes, subject to the district's rules, including the permit maintenance obligations that had been implemented over the decades. A permit issued by the district was not simply a recognition of a pre-existing property right. It was an administrative authorization, a grant of permission to pump a specified volume under specified conditions, including the condition that the permit holder comply with the district's reporting requirements. A permit that lapsed for non-compliance was not a property right that had been confiscated. It was an administrative authorization that had been withdrawn for failure to meet the conditions of its maintenance. The replacement permit that Earl was entitled to apply for was a new administrative authorization under the rules currently in effect. It carried no seniority derived from the original 1937 permit, because the 1937 permit was no longer operative. The district's allocation formula applied the same rates to all new permits, regardless of the applicant's history, because the formula was based on aquifer conditions and conservation requirements, rather than on administrative precedent. Continuous use of the well had demonstrated that the Stroud family had a genuine need for groundwater and had been pumping throughout the period in question. It had not maintained the permit. The permit was maintained by annual reporting. The annual reporting had been inconsistent. The permit had lapsed under the district's rules. Continuous use does not preserve a permit if compliance lapses. Earl applied for a replacement permit in July 1984. The application was processed under the district's current allocation framework. His 480-acre operation received a permitted annual volume calculated at the current per-acre rate of 1.5 acre-feet per year, a rate that reflected the district's conservation objectives and the aquifer's current depletion status in Castro County. His total new permitted volume was 720 acre-feet per year. His original 1937 permit had carried an allocated volume of 1,840 acre-feet per year, a figure that reflected the early regulatory environment and the per-acre rates applicable in the late 1930s before the district's conservation framework had been developed. The difference was 1,120 acre-feet per year, a reduction of 61% in his permitted pumping volume. Earl farmed 480 acres under irrigation. His crop mix, cotton on the lighter soils, grain sorghum on the heavier ground, with some winter wheat in rotation, had been calibrated over decades to the water availability that the original permit had supported. A 61% reduction in permitted volume required fundamental changes to what he could grow and how he could grow it. He converted approximately 200 acres from irrigated cotton to dryland production, a shift that reduced his yield expectations substantially, but brought his irrigation demand within the new permit's limits. The remaining 280 acres continued under irrigation at reduced application rates that the new permit could support. The well was the same well August had drilled in 1937. The aquifer beneath it was the same aquifer. The pump was the same pump Earl had installed in 1967, still serviceable. The physical infrastructure of the operation had not changed. What had changed was the legal status of the authorization to use it. The 1937 permit had entitled the Stroud family to pump 1,840 acre-feet per year from a well they had maintained and relied on for 47 years. The permit had been issued when the district's regulatory framework was in its early development, before conservation requirements had been systematically applied, before the aquifer's finite nature had been translated into the per-acre allocation rules that governed new permits in the 1980s. The reporting requirement that had been added in 1971 was administrative, a one-page form filed annually, documenting what the family had been doing all along. Earl had understood it as a routine obligation. He had not understood that inconsistent compliance could extinguish the allocation that his grandfather's early application had secured. The form arrived every December. Some years he filed it, some years he did not. The well pumped either way, the water came up either way, the crop grew either way, until the district's auditors came and the board met, and the letter arrived in May 1984. The well was the same, the permit was gone. Same well, different legal status. Continuous use does not preserve a permit if compliance lapses.